Hello, YouTube. We're continuing today with the world as will and representation. Yesterday we stopped early at the end of the first paragraph, which finished with the world is representation, which is to say relational. This truth is not at all new. It was already present in the skeptical considerations that served as Descartes' point of departure. Berkeley, however, was the first to express it definitely. He rendered an eternal service to philosophy by doing so, even though the rest of his teaching cannot survive. Kant's first mistake was to neglect this proposition, as is shown in the appendix. On the other hand, W. Jones, in the last of his papers on the philosophy of the Asiatics, in Asiatic Researchers, volume 464, testifies as to how early this basic truth was recognized by the wisdom of the Indians, appearing as it does as the fundamental tenet of the Vedanta philosophy attributed to the Vyasa. The fundamental tenet of the Vedanta school consisted not in denying the existence of matter, that is, of solidity, impenetrability, and extended figure, to deny which would be lunacy, but in correcting the popular notion of it and in contending that it has no essence independent of mental perception, that existence and perceptibility are convertible terms. These words are quite sufficient to express the compatibility of the empirical reality with transcendental ideality. In this first book, we consider the world from this side alone, namely insofar as it is representation. However, the inner reluctance with which anyone accepts that the world is merely their representation, even though the acceptance is inescapable, shows that irrespective of its truth, this aspect is one-sided and hence the result of some arbitrary abstraction. We will make up for its one-sidedness in the next book by means of another truth, a truth that is not as immediately certain as our present point of departure, and one that can only be achieved through more profound research, more difficult abstractions, separating what is different and unifying what is the same. Separating what is different and unifying what is the same, a truth that must be very serious and alarming, if not terrifying to anyone, a truth that can and must be maintained by him as well, namely this: the world is my will. Until then, however, that is, in this first book, we must steadfastly consider the world from the side where we have started, the side from which it can be known in cognition. Accordingly, and without reluctance, we will consider all existing objects, even our bodies themselves, as we will soon discuss in greater detail, is simply as representations, and will call them mere representations. In so doing, we will abstract, as will hopefully become clear to anyone later, from the will the sole constituent of the other side of the world. For the world is, on the one side, completely representation, just as it is on the other side completely will. However, a reality that would be neither of these, but rather an object in itself, and unfortunately, this is what Kant's thing in itself has surreptitiously denigrated into, is a fantastic absurdity, and to assume such a thing is a philosophical will-o'-the-wisp. Will-o'-the-wisp. Okay, I've never heard that, so I'll just search that and see what that comes up with. And copy, and I could just go over to the old Google and move the floating controls out of the way. Let's see what that actually means. Will-o'-the-wisp, or ignis fatuus, is a mysterious flickering light seen over swamps and marshes, appearing as a ghostly blue or pale flame that lures travellers astray in folklore, but scientifically explained as flammable gases like methane and phosphine from decaying matter igniting, possibly sparked by microlighting from water bubbles, leading to its depiction as mischievous spirits, fairies, and lost souls in myths worldwide, often called jack-o'-lanterns or corpse candles. Okay. Philosophical something that is elusive, deceptive, or unattainable goal, hope, or idea that lures you in but is impossible to grasp. That's what I know. 2, section 2. The subject is the seat of all cognition, but is itself not cognized by anything. Accordingly, it is the support for the world, and always presupposes as the general condition of all appearances, of all objects. Whatever exists only for the subject. We all find ourselves as this subject, although only insofar as we have cognition of things, not insofar as we are objects of cognition. But the body is already an object, and from this point of view, we call it too a representation. This is because the body is an object among objects and must obey the law of objects, even though it is an immediate object. On the Principle of Sufficient Reason, second edition, section 22. Like all objects of intuition, it is situated within the forms of all cognition in space and time, by means of which there is multiplicity. The subject, on the one hand, having cognition but never cognized, is not situated within these forms, which in fact always already presuppose it. Neither multiplicity nor its opposite, unity, apply to the subject. We never have any cognition of the subject. Rather, when there is cognition at all, cognition is what has that cognition. The subject is what has that cognition. There are two essential, necessary, and inseparable halves to the world as representation, and here we are considering it only from this point of view, the world. Separable halves too. The first half is the object, whose form is space and time, and thus multiplicity. The other half, however, is the subject, which does not lie in either space or time, because it is present complete. It is present, complete, and undivided in each representing being. From this it follows that a single such being with its object completes the world as representation just as much as the millions in existence do, And if this single representing being were to disappear, the world as representation could no longer exist. Consequently, these two halves are inseparable even in thought, because each of them has meaning and exists only through and for the other. Each is present when the other is as well, and disappears when the other disappears. They share a common border where the object begins, the subject ends. That they share a border is shown by the fact that the most essential and therefore most general forms of all objects, space-time causality, can be discovered and fully comprehended starting out from the subject, even in the absence of any cognition of the object itself. In Kantian terms, these forms lie in our consciousness a priori. One of Kant's chief merits, and it is a very great one, is to have discovered this. But I go further and claim that the principle of sufficient reason is the common term for all these forms that objects have and that we are conscious of a priori. And so everything we know purely a priori is nothing other than the very content of this principle and what can be deduced from it. This principle, therefore, expresses the totality of our a priori and certain cognition. In my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, I showed in detail how every possible object is subject to this principle, that is, how every such object stands in a necessary relation to other objects, on the one hand as determined and on the other hand as determining. This goes so far that the entire being of all objects, insofar as they are objects, that is, representations and nothing else, can be, this goes so far as the entire being of all objects can be exclusively traced back to the necessary relation of objects to each other, so that the being of objects consists in nothing but this relation and is therefore completely relative. We will have more to say about this later. Moreover, I have shown that the necessary relation expressed in general by the principle of sufficient reason appears in different forms corresponding to the classes into which objects fall according to their possibility. And again, this is what guarantees that the classification is correct. Here I assume throughout that the reader is presently familiar with what I said in that work, because if I had not already said it, it would necessarily belong at this point. Section 3. The most important division among all our representations is between the intuitive and the abstract. The latter, the abstract, form only one group of representations, namely concepts. Of all the creatures on earth, only human beings possess concepts and the ability to conceptualize, which has always been referred to as reason. Kant was the only one to have mixed up this concept of reason. In this regard, I refer to the appendix as well as to my two fundamental problems of ethics on the basis of morals, section 6. Of all the creatures on earth, only human beings possess concepts and the ability to conceptualize, which has always been referred to as reason. Of all the creatures on earth, only human beings possess concepts and the ability to conceptualize distinguishes humans from all animals. That doesn't really make a good sentence. Of all the creatures on earth, only human beings possess concepts, distinguishes humans from animals. And the ability to conceptualize distinguishes humans from animals. Later, we will consider these abstract representations on their own, but first we will discuss only intuitive representations, not conceptual. These then encompass the entire visible world or the world of experience. These intuitive representations encompass the entire visible world and the whole of experience, including the conditions for the possibility of experience. I just copy. I just do this. Paste. These next. That way. These intuitive representations. Intuitive representations then encompass the entire visible world. These intuitive representations rather than conceptual. We have already mentioned Kant's highly significant discovery about these conditions. These forms of the visible world, that would be space-time, and that is, about what is most universal in the perception of the visible world, what belongs to all appearances in the visible world in the same way, time and space. I'll put that in here when I was having a bit of a sing session. That is time and space. He discovered that time and space can not only be conceived abstractly on their own and independently of their content, but they can also be intuited immediately. This intuition is not some phantasm, where am I? Derived from repeated experience. Rather, it is something independent of experience, and to such an extent that experience must in fact be conceived as dependent on it, since the properties of time and space, as they are known a priori in intuition, apply to all possible experience as laws that it must always come out in accordance with. This is the reason why in my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, I considered space and time as special autonomous groups of representations insofar as they are pure intuitions without content. Now, Kant's discovery of this characteristic of the universal forms of intuition is important in the following way. These universal forms are themselves intuitions in their own right, independent of experience, and they can be recognised by their thorough conformity to law, which is the ground of the infallibility of mathematics. But it is also no less noteworthy a property of these forms that the principle of sufficient reason, which determines experience as the law of causality and motivation, while it determines thought as the law of the grounding of judgment, makes, okay, but it is also no less noteworthy Okay, I'll start from here. Now, Kant's discovery of this characteristic of the universal forms of intuition is important in the following way. These universal forms of intuition are themselves intuitions in their own right, independent of experience, and these universal forms of intuition can be recognized by their thorough conformity to law, which is the ground of the infallibility of mathematics. But it is also no less noteworthy, a property of these forms, that the principle of sufficient reason makes its appearance here in a most distinctive guise, which I call the ground of being, which determines experience as the law of causality and motivation, while it determines thought as the law of the grounding of judgment, principle of sufficient reason, and which I call the ground of being. But it is also no less noteworthy a property of these forms that the principle of sufficient reason makes its appearance here in the most distinctive guise, which I call the ground of being, the universal form of intuition. This is the reason why in my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, I considered space and time as a special autonomous group of representations, insofar as space and time are pure intuitions without content. Now, Kant's discovery of this characteristic of the universal forms of intuition as space and time, as is important. Now, Kant's discovery of this characteristic of the universal forms of intuition, as they've got no content, space and time, is important in the following way. These universal forms are the universal forms. These universal forms of intuition as space and time are themselves intuitions in their own right, independent of experience, and they can be recognized by their thorough conformity to law, which is the ground of the infallibility of mathematics. But it is also no less worthy a property of these forms that the principle of sufficient reason makes its appearance here in the most distinctive guise, which I call the ground of being. Still not 100% clear on that. I'll just take it up like so. And I'll just delete that thing. Paste. Where did I get? Nothing. Ah, bloody bastard. Where is it? Here. I'm trying to get it here. Right. This could be it. Copy that. And then I'll delete that. Delete, mate. Paste. Okay. I consider space and time as a special autonomous group of representations, insofar as they are pure intuitions without content. Now, Kant's discovery of this characteristic of the universal forms of intuition is important in the following way. These universal forms are themselves intuitions in their own right, independent of experience, and they can be recognised by their thorough conformity to law, which is the ground of the infallibility of mathematics. But it is also no less noteworthy a property of these forms that the principle of sufficient reason, which determines experience as the law of causality and motivation, while it determines thought as the law of grounding of the grounding of Kant, of the grounding of judgment, of the grounding of judgment, of the grounding of judgment. But it is also no less noteworthy, a property of these forms, that the principle of sufficient reason, which determines experience as the law of causality and motivation, while it determines thought as the law of the grounding of judgment, sufficient reason makes its appearance here in a most distinctive guise, which I call the ground of being. Coffee hair. Got it. It's not loud thing, they're not. I just leave myself a note saying I'm not too sure exactly what the ground of being is. I'm unsure exactly what the ground of being is. The ground of being is. Is it the space and time? Space and time? Space and time. Yeah, I think it would be. I consider space and time as a special autonomous group of representation insofar as space and time are pure intuitions without content. Now, Kant's discovery of this fact about space and time being pure intuitions without content, now Kant's discovery of this characteristic of the universal forms of intuition as space and time is important in the following way. These universal forms of space and time as intuitions are themselves intuitions in their own right, independent of experience, and the space and time can be recognised by their thorough conformity to law, which is the ground of the infallibility of mathematics. But space and time is also no less noteworthy, a property of these forms, that the principle of sufficient reason makes its appearance here in the most distinctive guise, which I call the ground of being. In time, this ground is the succession of moments, and in space, the position of its parts that determine each other reciprocally and ad infinitum. It is the space and time. Phone call. Might be some. That I won't hear it because I'm on the radio, leaving a voice message. That's all right. Readers who see clearly from my introductory essay that the principle of sufficient reason has a unified content in spite of its different forms will also be convinced how important cognition of the simplest of those forms, which I have identified as time, is for an insight into their own innermost essence. All right, we'll just translate that as readable again. Readers who see clearly from my introductory essay that the principle of sufficient reason has a unified content in spite of its different forms will also be convinced how important cognition of the simplest of those forms, time, is for an insight into their own innermost essence. Okay. How important time is. They will be convinced that every moment in time exists only insofar as it has annihilated the previous moment, its father, only to be annihilated just as quickly in its turn. They will be convinced that past and future, setting aside the consequence of their contents, are as unreal as any dream, that the present is only the border between the two and so has neither extension nor duration. We will also recognise the same unreality in all the other forms of the principle of sufficient reason. We will see that as it is with time, so it is with space, and as it is with space, so it is with everything that is in both space and time. Everything, therefore, that arises from cause or motivation or motive exists only through and for something else similar to itself. That is, something that has only the same relative existence. In essence, this view is ancient. We see it in Heraclitus when he bemoans the eternal flux of things, in Plato's disparaging account of objects as eternally becoming but never being, in Spinoza's doctrine of the mere accidents of a single substance, which is the only thing that exists or endures, in the way Kant opposes what we have this kind of cognition of as mere appearance to things in themselves. In the end, it is the age-old wisdom of India that speaks here. It is Maya, the veil of deception that covers the eyes of mortals and lets them see a world that cannot be described as either being or not being. For it is like a dream, like sunlight reflected off sand that a distant traveller mistakes for water, or like a discarded rope that the traveller thinks is a snake. These comparisons are repeated countless times in the Vedas and the Puranas. What all these meant, what they were speaking about, is the very thing we are considering here, the world as representation, subject to the principle of sufficient reason. Section 4. To recognise, I might just make a note that that's all in section 3. Section 3. I'll just write section 3. It's easier that way, isn't it? And I'll put that as a double. Heading 2. Okay. Now I'll just put section 4. Excuse me, while I do some, whatever you call it. To recognise the whole essence of time, it is enough to recognise the form of the principle of sufficient reason that appears in pure time as such and is the basis for all counting and calculation. Time is, in fact, nothing over and above this very form. It has no other properties. The form of the principle of sufficient reason in time is succession. and succession is the whole essence of time. Further, for exhaustive cognition of the whole essence of space, it is enough to recognize the principle of sufficient reason as it governs the pure intuition of space. Space in its entirety is nothing other than the possibility of reciprocal determination of its parts, that is, position. The whole of geometry consists in considering this possibility in detail and laying down its consequences in abstract concepts for convenient application. In just the same way, to recognize the entire essence of matter as such, it is enough to recognize the form of the principle of sufficient reason governing the content of the forms of space and time, what makes them perceptible, that is, matter, that is to say, the law of causality. Matter is, in its entirety, nothing other than causality, which is immediately apparent to anyone who thinks about it. This amounts to saying that for matter, its being is its acting, and it is inconceivable that matter has any other being. Only by acting can it fill space and time. Its action on the immediate object, which is itself matter, is a condition for intuition, and matter can exist only in intuition. Is intuition like sensation? I thought it was more of a guess, you know? I'll have to copy that and go into the dictionary. Isn't that just a pain in the bottom? I don't know what's going on. Is that the dictionary? Yes, it is. Intuition, the ability to understand something instinctively without the need for conscious reasoning. A thing that one knows or considers likely from instinctive feeling rather than conscious reasoning. It's the late Middle English denoting spiritual insight or immediate spiritual communication, from late Latin intuitio, from Latin intuere, consider, intuit, understand or work out by instinct, intuitable, late 70s, in the sense of instruct, teach, from Latin intuit, contemplated, from the verb intuere, from in, upon, and tuere, to look. So it's sense from your instincts. An innate, typically fixed pattern of behaviour in animals in response to certain stimuli, a natural or intuitive way of acting or thinking, a natural propensity or skill, a specific kind of fact or quality of possessing innate behavioural patterns. Beautiful field with a quality, especially a desirable one. Also in the sense of instigation, impulse, from Latin instinctus, impulse, from the verb instinguere, from in towards, stinguere, to prick. Yeah, some sensation, I think. Only by acting can it, what's it again? Matter. Can matter fill space and time? Matter's action on the immediate object, which is itself matter, is a condition for intuition, and matter can exist only in intuition. I'm going to converse with the bot, because in intuition seems to me to be in the mind, but how does the mind reach the matter? It's by sensation. Do I need to clarify? I think I do. I'll just won't rely on my own brain. I'll use the bots, because they know everything that's been, even though they put it together a bit wrong somewhere. matter only, how can matter exist only in intuition? See what it says. You can't see that. There might be something I can do about that. This. Okay, so this one maybe. No. Take that off. Do that work? In here? No. Yeah, settings. That's what it's bad. Oh, it's got me more options. Screen share. Sorry. I just want to untick that thing, mate. So I'll just reshare. Out of the way. Share. What's this? No, it's that. Now, let's untick sharing windows. Okay, so let's open it up. It's that GPT. I don't know. Share. Let me see. Can you see that? Doesn't look like it. Oh, well, I'll just read it. It's not supposed to. You see the notifications come up instead. It doesn't look like you can see ChatGPT. PT. This question only really makes sense inside Kant's and then Schopenhauer's transcendental framework, so I'll answer it in those terms. Short answer, matter exists only in intuition because matter is not a thing in itself, but a mode of appearance, something that exists only as it is given to a subject through the forms of intuition, space and time, and structured by the understanding, causality. What intuition means here, crucial for Kant. In Kant and Schopenhauer, intuition does not mean a vague feeling or insight. It means immediate sensible givenness, how something is directly presented to a subject. And crucially, all intuition is sensory, or sensory intuition is structured a priori by space, outer sense, time in a sense. So intuition is the condition under which anything can appear to us at all. Why matter cannot exist outside intuition. Matter, as we experience it, is defined by extension, occupying space, persistence in change, time, causal interaction. But space and time are not properties of things in themselves. They are forms of intuition supplied by the subject. So if you remove intuition, no space, no extension, no time, no persistence or change, no causality, only no interaction. Without intuition, nothing remains that could count as matter. Thus, matter is not an independent substrate. Matter equals appearance under spatial temporal intuition. Kant's precise position: for Kant, matter is empirical reality, but transcendentally ideal. Meaning it is real for us, but its mode of being depends on the conditions of possible experience. So when Kant says matter exists only in intuition, he means matter exists only as an object for a subject, never as a thing in itself. There may be something that grounds appearances, but matter is not it. Schopenhauer sharpens the claim. Schopenhauer goes further and strips away Kant's ambiguities. For Schopenhauer, the world equals representation, representation equals object or a subject, and all objects, including matter, exist only within representation. He reduces matter to objectivity under causality in space and time. Matter is not substance, not stuff, but the lawful appearance of forces in intuition. This is why he can say bluntly, no object without a subject. What this does not mean, common mistake, is it does not mean matter is imaginary, matter is optional, matter is merely psychological. Rather, matter is phenomenally necessary, but ontologically conditioned. You cannot step outside intuition to check whether matter exists on its own, because existence is an object already presupposed as an object. Existence as an object already presupposes intuition. A helpful formulation, you might say it this way: matter does not exist in intuition like something stored in a container. Matter exists as intuition structured by space, time, and causality. Or even more sharply, very Schopenhauerian, matter is what intuition looks like when governed by causality. If you want, next we can contrast this with naive realism, link it to the body without organs and pre-organized matter, or unpack how will escapes intuition while matter does not. None of the above. We will continue. Okay, so I'll just go back up a bit. I'll start the section 4 again. To recognize the whole essence of time, it is enough to recognize the form of the principle of sufficient reason that appears in pure time as such and is the basis for all counting and calculation. Time is, in fact, nothing over and above this very form. It has no other properties. The form of the principle of sufficient reason in time is succession, and succession is the whole essence of time. Further, for exhaustive cognition of the whole essence of space, it is enough to recognize the principle of sufficient reason as it governs the pure intuition of space. Wait, I was concentrating on something else. The form of the principle of sufficient reason in time is succession, and succession is the whole essence of time. Further, for exhaustive cognition of the whole essence of space, it is enough to recognise the principle of sufficient reason as it governs the pure intuition of space. Space in its entirety is nothing other than the possibility of reciprocal determination of its parts, that is, position. The whole of geometry consists in considering this possibility in detail and laying down its consequences in abstract concepts for convenient application. In just the same way, to recognise the entire essence of matter as such, it is enough to recognise the form of the principle of sufficient reason governing the content of the forms of space and time. What makes them perceptible, that is, matter, that is to say, the law of causality. Matter is, in its entirety, nothing other than causality, which is immediately apparent to anyone who thinks about it. This amounts to saying that for matter, its being is its acting, and it is inconceivable that matter has any other being. Only by acting can it feel space and time. Its action on the immediate object, which is itself matter, is a condition for intuition. And matter can exist only in intuition. We can know the result of one material object acting upon another only if the second object now has a different effect on the immediate object than it did before. Indeed, the effect is nothing more than this. The whole being of matter, therefore, lies in cause and effect. For matter, its being is its acting. For more details on this, see my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, section 21, page 77, footnote 4, which is how it's altered from edition to edition. I've skipped over that. Oh, it's not that there. It is very much to the point that the German term for the sum total of everything material is Wirklichkeit, actuality. Mirror. It is astonishing how words are suitable to certain things, and the linguistic usage of the ancients designates many things in the most appropriate way. Seneca. Actuality. Okay, it is very much to the point that the German term for the sum total of everything material is Wirklichkeit, actuality, a much more expressive word than Realitat, reality. Matter acts. I'll just keep that just because I wanna. Copy. Copy, and then I'll go the old purple, and are we still at section 4? Yeah. It is very much to the point that the German term for the sum total of everything material is Wirklichkeit, actuality, a much more expressive word than Realitat, reality. Just because the form, how do you spell it? So the matter is being, it's being, because the being of matter is to act. Oh, that done it. Where'd it go? No, I'm going to take out one of those. Anyway, no. What if I get the bottom one? There we go. Because the being of matter is to act. Matter acts only on matter. So like a will only acts on a will in nature, on another will, which is, or lock, substances of different natures can't exist in the same, exist but as different natures in the same spot of time and space, because they act on each other otherwise. And they'd be in their position, and that would be a bit impossible because unless they're different substances. Brr. Summer here and I'm frozen. Where's my gloves? I've only got a very thin jumper on. Matter acts only on matter, which is why the whole being and essence of matter consists simply in the law-like alteration that one part of matter brings about in another, and is therefore completely relative according to a relation that is valid only within its limits, just like space and just like time. Which is why the whole being and essence of matter consists simply in a law-like alteration that one part of matter brings about on another. It's cause and effect then? Time and space, however, can each be represented on its own in intuition, even without matter. Matter, on the other hand, cannot be represented without space and time. Even the form, even the form, even the form. I'll just ask a question. Oh, copper. What colour? Blue. Paste. Time and space, however, can each be represented on its own in intuition, even without matter. Matter, on the other hand, cannot be represented without time and space. How so? How can space and time and time and time be intuited into it without matter, how can they be intuited? How can they be intuited? Moreover, without matter. And moreover, without matter. Moreover, without matter. I probably missed that. I should read it again. Is that right, probably? I'll bold it so I remember when I'm in the reading group to ask that question. It's a double one, isn't it? Two at the end. Even the form, which is inseparable from matter, already presupposes space. Even the form, which is inseparable from matter, already presupposes space. The form of space and time. Inseparable. What's the form? Even the form, which is inseparable from matter, already presupposes space. And the activity of matter, which is its whole being, always concerns alteration and therefore always concerns a determination of time. Okay. But matter does not presuppose space and time merely individually. Rather, the combination of the two constitutes the essence of matter, precisely because the essence is, as has been demonstrated, action, that is, causality. This is because all the countless conceivable appearances and states of affairs could coexist in infinite space without restricting each other, or they could succeed each other in infinite time without mutual disturbance. But in these cases, there would not be any necessary relation between states of affairs and no need for a rule to determine that relation. Indeed, such a rule could never be applied. Okay, so I'll just read that again. But matter does not presuppose space and time merely individually, but rather the combination of the two constitutes the essence of matter, precisely because the essence is, as has been demonstrated, action, that is, causality. This is because all the countless conceivable appearances and states of affairs could coexist in infinite space without restricting each other, or they could succeed each other in infinite time without mutual disturbance. But in these cases, there would not be any necessary relation between states of affairs and no need for a rule to determine that relation. Indeed, such a rule could never be applied. Consequently, is that when it's individualized? Consequently, even with coexistence in space and time, space and change, consequently, even with coexistence in space and change in time, there still would not be causality as long as each of these two forms continued to run its own course without any connection to the other. And since causality is, in fact, the essence of matter, there would be no matter either. But the law of causality gets its meaning and necessity from this alone, that the essence of alteration is not mere change of state itself, but rather lies in the fact that one and the same position in space contains now this state of affairs, but then later another, and the fact that at one and the same particular time there is one state here but another state over there. Only this mutual constraint of space and time lends meaning and at the same time necessity to the rule that governs the way alterations must proceed. The law of causality, therefore, does not determine the succession of states simply in time, but in fact determines this succession with respect to a particular space. And it does not determine the existence of states in a particular location, but in fact in this location at a particular time. So alteration, that is change that takes place according to causal law, always concerns a particular space, part of space, and simultaneously, and together with this, a particular part of time. Consequently, causality unites space and time. But we have found that the whole essence of matter lies in action, that is, in causality. As a result, matter must also unify space and time, that is, matter must possess the properties of both time and space simultaneously. However much the two conflict with each other, matter must reconcile in itself what is impossible in each one, the fleeting course of time and the rigid and unchanging persistence of space. It derives infinite divisibility from both. Thus, we find that matter involves, in the first place, simultaneity, which cannot take place either in mere time, which has no coexistence, or in mere space, which has no before, after, or now. But in fact, the simultaneous existence of multiple states constitutes the essence of actuality because, in fact, because it first makes duration possible, in that duration itself can be known only in contrast to a change in something present at the same time, and also because change can be characterized as alteration, that is, variation of quality and form in the persistent substance, that is, matter, only by means of what endures throughout the change. That matter and substance are identical is shown in detail in the appendix. If the world existed only in space, it would be rigid and unmoving. There would be no succession, no alteration, no activity. But with activity, the representation of matter is also removed. On the other hand, no, there would be no succession, no alteration, no activity. But with activity, the representation of matter is also removed. Okay. This one. Eyes. Eyes. Where was it? If the world exists only in space and time, it would be rigid and unmoving. There is no success, no. This, what color? Red. Eyes. But isn't representation the relation? Isn't matter a relation? But if the world was only space, then there would be no relation. Okay. You wouldn't need to relate. Okay. Um, ugh, my spanner just went big next time. Stop. On the other hand, mm, ah, if the world existed only in time, everything would be fleeting. There would be no persistence, no coexistence, thus no simultaneity, consequently no duration, and therefore, again, no matter. Only through the unification of time and space is there matter, that is, the possibility of simultaneity, and through that duration, and again through these, the persistence of substance during alteration of state. This is also the reason for Kant's definition of matter as what is movable in space, metaphysical foundations of natural science, because motion is nothing but the unification of space and time. But because it has no essence in the unification of space and time, matter clearly bears the mark of both. Matter attests to its origin in space, partly through form, from which it is inseparable of action, but more particularly through its persistence, substance. This is because change is a property of time alone. There is nothing enduring in time considered on its own, which shows that the a priori certainty of persistence is derived entirely from the certainty of space, not, as Kant has it, from cognition of time, as is shown in the appendix. Matter reveals its origin in time through quality, accident. To appear at all, matter needs quality, which is in itself always causality, that is, action on another piece of matter, and therefore alteration, a temporal concept. The law-likeness of the action, however, always refers to both space and time. This is the only thing that gives it meaning. The law-likeness of the action, however, always refers to both space and time, and this law-likeness of action is the only thing that gives matters meaning. Causality can legislate nothing more than what kind of state occurs at a particular time and in a particular place. This derivation of the fundamental determinations of matter from forms of cognition that we are conscious of a priori is the basis for our recognition of certain properties of matter as a priori, namely the ability to fill space. That is, impenetrability, which is to say activity, as well as extension, infinite divisibility, persistence, that is, indestructibility, and finally, mobility. On the other hand, gravity is rather to be counted on the side of a posteriori cognition, despite its universality, and even though Kant treats it as cognizable a priori in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, page 71, Rosenkratz edition, page 372. Just as the object exists only for the subject as its representation, so each particular class of representations exists only for an equally specific disposition in the subject. These dispositions are called cognitive faculties, and Kant's name for the subjective correlate of time and space, considered in themselves as empty forms, is pure sensibility. Since Kant broke new ground here, the expression may be retained, even though it is not quite appropriate, since sensibility already presupposes matter. The subjective correlate of matter, or causality, since the two are the same, is the understanding, and it is nothing other than this. To have cognition of causality is the understanding's only function, its single capability, and it is a great and sweeping one with many applications and an unmistakable unity behind each of its manifestations. Conversely, all causality and therefore all matter, and with it the whole of actuality exists only for the understanding, through the understanding, and in the understanding. The first and simplest manifestation of the understanding, which, in addition, is always present, is the intuition of the actual world. And this is absolutely nothing other than cognition of the cause based on the effect. Consequently, all intuition is intellectual. Nonetheless, we might never reach this if we were not immediately acquainted with some effect that could serve as a starting point. But there are, in fact, such effects in the animal body. To this extent, such bodies are the immediate objects of the subject. They mediate the intuition of all other objects. The changes that every animal body experiences are cognized immediately, that is, they are sensed, and insofar as this effect is referred back to its cause, the intuition arises of this cause as an object. This referring is not a conclusion drawn from abstract concepts. It does not take place in reflection and is not voluntary. Rather, it is immediate, necessary, and certain. It is the mode of cognition of the pure understanding. Without this, there would never be intuition, and only a dull, plant-like consciousness of alterations in the immediate object would remain. These alterations would follow one after the other in utter meaningless succession, unless, as pain or pleasure, they had some meaning for the will. But just as the visible world is there as soon as the sun rises, so too the understanding, with its one simple function, transforms dull, meaningless sensation into intuition in one foul swoop. With the eye, the ear, the hand, senses, with the eye, the ear, the hand, senses, is not an intuition, only merely data. Only when the understanding proceeds from the effect back to the cause is the world present in intuition, spread out in space, its form capable of change, its matter persisting throughout all time, because the understanding unites space and time in the representation of matter, that is, activity. Just as the world as representation exists only through the understanding, it exists only for the understanding as well. In the first chapter of my essay on vision and colors, I could have already discussed how the understanding creates an intuition out of the data supplied by the senses, how the child learns to have intuitions by comparing the impressions of the same object received by the various senses, how in fact this is the only thing that sheds light on so many sensory phenomena, such as seeing a single image with two eyes, or the experience of double vision when squinting or when viewing objects at different distances from the eye in a single glance, as well as all illusions caused by a sudden alteration of the sense organs. But I have gone into this important topic much more deeply and in much more detail in the second edition of my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, section 21. Everything I wrote there, in fact, belongs at this point and therefore really should be repeated here, but I am also almost as averse to copying my own work as someone else's, and I am not in a position to present it better here than I did there. So rather than repeat myself, I refer to that text and now assume that the reader is acquainted with it. The way children and congenitally blind people who recover their vision learn to see, the fact that we see a single object but sense it twice, once with each eye, double vision and double touching, when the sense organs are displaced from their usual position, the upright appearance of objects when their image in the eye is upside down, the projection of colour, which is a purely internal function, a polarized distribution of the eye's activity onto external objects. And finally, the stereoscopic. All these are solid and irrefutable proofs that intuition is, in every case, not based merely on the senses, but is intellectual. It is pure understanding-based cognition of the cause given the effect, and hence it presupposes the law of causality. As a result, the possibility of any intuition, and with it any experience, is wholly and fundamentally dependent on cognition of the law of causality. And conversely, this cognition is not dependent on experience, as Hume's skepticism maintains, a view that receives its first refutation here. The fact that cognition of causation is independent of all experience, that is, the fact that it is a priori, can be clearly demonstrated only by showing that experience is dependent on it. And this in turn can happen only by proving, as I've done here and in other places referred to, that cognition of causation is already contained in intuition in general, which is where all experience lies, and therefore that cognition of causation is completely a priori in relation to experience and presupposed by experience as a condition rather than itself presupposing experience. This result cannot be proved in the way attempted by Kant, a method that I criticise in my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, section 23. Section 5. Excuse me. Section 5. Yeah, I'll stop there. It's been an hour and a half. So to do that, I must break with this share and end situation. So goodbye, YouTube. Thank you for your attendance and watching, and see you later.